So those speed-oriented days, and again, as I said, it's a very, very much simplified version of the things. In practice, it's probably way more. It's clearly way more complex. But again, I'm just using that as a framework to discuss the different decisions that we can make to select our weapons. So on speed days, it's going to be again some more type 1 and more type 2 over longer periods. But the most important, if those games have to allow players to reach higher speed, to be in the topic of the day of reaching high velocities over longer distance, we need to use wider pitches and likely more players. And if there are small players, likely to have a pitch that has with more depth than width to increase the ability of players to reach higher speed. Some specific rules can be implemented as well, but I don't want to go further into that, like having the players to need to receive a ball behind the defenders at some stage, playing with the offside rule as well, of course, which is always can be an issue. But the idea is to help and to make to implement a different setup so that players can reach higher speed. The tactical sessions, including building up or finishing, are often pretty interesting in terms of touching and reaching higher speed as well. So what about the neuromuscular responses? Again, the same slide to those sessions. CMG improvement, small decrease in groin squeeze, improvement in stiffness, so no clear fatigue, no change in the peak force impact, and as the endurance, tendency for a decreased locomotor efficiency, which is also likely related to the amount of volume of sprinting. But again, is this going to be a problem in the premium recovery? That's something that is unknown. But again, the changes are not massive in this regard. To go a bit further and to finish off this part on the use of small-sided games and to modulate further the response to those small-sided games, there are many adjustments in rules that can be added. Simple things as we discussed, the game simulation with goalkeepers versus game possession without is probably the easiest way to modulate the intensity of mechanical work, as we've seen. Adding wide players on the side just to pass the ball if the pressure is too strong. That's an easy way to decrease the overall intensity, because having more players to play with will obviously help players players will be less involved and will likely have a bit of more time to recover as well. So that will help us to decrease the intensity of mechanical work. The number of touches, very simple ways as well to modulate the mechanical work. Most of the time, the greater the number of touches, the lower the demands. Because that just means players have more ability and time to make decisions and so on. Lately, as we alluded a little bit before too as well, the shape of the playing area with a longer pitch allowing for high-speed runnings to be reached when it's what we are expecting for. That's a good way. Sometimes, conversely, for many reasons, coaches might not want to see a high speed running component. So having a pitch that is more large than the depth will actually tend to increase mechanical work while restraining the high speed running intensity as well. So simple adjustments, but very simple outcomes as well for that. The last aspect, because we've been talking about the team so far, the team responses, when we're trying to modulate the mechanical aspects of those demands during games, but for individuals, the only options, but it's a valuable option, it's an interesting option, is to use players as floaters or jokers, depending on how it's called. And we managed to show recently that irrespective of the type of games, could be small or larger games, the floaters, so which is a player which actually always with the team in possessions of the ball, so he always has the ball, so he doesn't defend, and the rule is that he can't kick or score a goal, but he's always in activity. So he's kind of in a possession mode himself, while the others are competing, likely into more game simulation with goalkeepers. So what happened for this player individually? He will systematically present a less high-intensity running and less total distance than the others, but interestingly as well, about 25 to 30% less mechanical work intensity. So that just fits perfectly, especially for players in returning from injury in the end part of the return to play process, having them used as floaters, that we allow them to be exposed to the specific demands of the game, especially the turns, the decelerations, and the decision making, but while still being at a lower level than when playing with the team. So it's kind of an intermediate step before joining the group. And those 20 to 35% difference are pretty interesting. To get something as specific in terms of football, but with those lower demand, it's pretty unique and it's really worth considering. And we're going to finish now this lecture by a few examples and practical examples of programming in a kind of a real life scenario. So most of the time, the incorporation of heat could be either at the team or the individual level, can be done in between two tactical sequences, for example. Most of the time, if we have a small-sided game with a fitness emphasis, that could be done after the warm-up, but before a tactical session, or could be at the end of the session, but more likely when it's a top-up for some players. And most of the time, in that case, there would be more the use of short intervals, as we've seen. But the most important is to integrate those additional heat formats in relation to the demands of the other sequence of the day. And obviously, having in mind that the technical demands also already have some physiological demands as well. So even if it's just about building up or some finishing, there will already be some demands in terms of aerobic demands, anaerobic demands, or the neuromuscular work through these technical demands. So we need to consider that the HIIT session will have to be another part of the puzzle of the overall session, and this is when sometimes errors or mistakes can be done, when even though the HIIT session itself seems relevant for that day, but if it doesn't really integrate well with the content of the tactical session, it can be a bit problematic. So the idea is that the HIIT should actually either compensate or at least be adjusted to the tactical requirement, so that the overall session makes sense overall, and so that we keep maximizing the stimulus for that day, and we avoid creating exerted fatigue, or even we just increase injury risk if the high-intensity training session is not really compatible with the tactical contents. So the optimal within session and within day programming of the different HIIT sequence is defined likely by the overall dynamic, so the coach, but rather than just the science or the physiology. Think about the coach, what he programs, and then how we build up the things around. And to go a bit further into, again, defining contents and selecting those formats, I'm going to have just two simple exercises. So let's say that's typical session will involve tactics over the full pitch. And the coach will probably be repeating a transition from the back and just working on building up and a fast transition. So clearly, this sequence might not be very, very demanding at the cardiorespiratory level, or might not be triggering highly the anaerobic system, but clearly that will involve a lot of high-speed running. So whatever is chosen after in terms of conditioning will have to be adjusted to this first part of the session. So my suggestion in that case will be to program a type 1 high-intensity training session. So that means targeting the cardiovascular system but avoiding neuromuscular load. Or eventually it could be a type 4, but in that case, the type 4 touching aerobic anaerobic and neuromuscular, making sure that the type 4 is actually only targeting the mechanical work aspect, so that we kind of complement the high-speed running from the tactical session, but we are not overloading the tactical session with more high-speed running to avoid just getting numbers to the roof. Conversely, if we have a bit the opposite, imagine in that case we have coaches working on tactics but more building ups in between lines but only over half of a pitch and working on short sequences of passes. This tactical session will likely to involve a lot of mechanical work, but probably not much high-speed running. So in that case, if we were to complement this sequence with some conditioning, we could definitely use, again, a type 1, if we consider that the amount of neuromuscular work, even if it's only mechanical work, it's enough, and we just go for a type 1 with no neuromuscular load, or we can offer eventually the option to do a session, a type 2 or a type 5, even types of conditioning. But in that case, the neuromuscular aspect of the type 2 or type 5 will have to be targeting around high-speed running to compensate for the lack of high-speed running during the tactical session. So simple examples, a bit probably really simple, but that's the idea, to adapt, to make sure the weapon, the format, fits and is actually relevant, appropriate, given the demands of the technical sessions. So now in terms of weekly programming, there are not many options. Either there is one match or two matches per week. So the amount of weekly high-intensity training prescription is likely depending on the player level, if they played none of that game, one game, or two games. And obviously, we're going to try to maintain the overall load pretty much stable if possible, so that even though they don't play, they still get more or less the amount of high-intensity running that they would have had if they had played, to keep that load and keep them ready for the game demands if they had so. So most of the time, especially for substitute, we're going to use a combination of the different hits. When we tend to play only when players play twice a week, it becomes very, very difficult for those who played to do any extra conditioning. So for players having played every 3 days, obviously there's no requirement at all to add some conditioning. So again, depends on the number of games played and the individual profile. But again, important to think about compensating either what has been done or not during sessions, or what has been done or not, or what the load that players have received through the games. So if we just now focus on something very more practical about a substitute session, if, for example, they still have more than 3 days before the next game, in practice, people tend to complement or to compensate, in that case, the load that the match has been lost or has been missed, with roughly adding what will represent minimum a 60-minute match. So in that case, a 60-minute match will mean to be covering minimum 6 kilometers, probably running at least 1K in terms of high-speed running, and with our metrics, which are not very standard, but that's something that I'm familiar with, would be more or less to touch or to have a target of 50 as the mechanical work. So to reach those targets in terms of high-speed running, total distance, or mechanical work, we could suggest those substitutes to play possession or small-sided games in terms of game simulation. If it's 8 versus 8, to start with the possession to get a bit volume, 2 times 10 minutes, for example. Then could be small-sided games, but 4x4 with goalkeepers to get an aerobic stimulus and get some high-intensity, quality mechanical work. So first part, type 4 with the small-sided games, and then another type 4, but more targeting high-speed running, that obviously was not touched through the small-sided games, and with the high-speed running, we could probably implement a 10-20 or a 15-15. As seen on the slide, with all those three elements, the 8 versus 8 possession, the 4x4 small-sided games, and then the high-speed, the generic running, we can more or less get all the numbers to equate close to the 60 minutes of a game. If in that case there is less than 3 days between those games, the substitute might still need to be trained to compensate for the game that didn't play, but obviously the overall load will have to be reduced to make sure they have recovered for the upcoming game, and we might still implement some generic type of conditioning, but probably more type 1 to make sure the neuromuscular demands are too high, or maybe a little bit of a progressive speed, just to get players touching some speed, so that we use what we were calling in the first part of the lecture the type 6, which don't have a metabolic component, but just a little bit of speed, but just to prepare the players to the demands. But again, everything way more conservative because of the overall the short time period before the next game. Okay, and we're gonna finish now by 3 examples of practical application during different moments of the season, where we have here to start with typical programming during preseason, where you can see on the top of the slide programmation of contents for the morning. In the afternoon we have contents as well, and in that context, what could be the optimal prescription in terms of high-speed training. So a first suggestion is on the 5th day, which will be just an afternoon session, but importantly, this afternoon session will precede a strength session the day after. So the implementation of this session will likely need to be a type 1 to make sure we don't increase too much the neuromuscular load, so that players keep some levels of freshness for the strength session the day after. So in that case, it could be a type 1 run-based, for example. In the morning, to complement the strength session, then it can be a type 4 in the form of a 4x4 small-sided games targeting the mechanical work aspect, so that we have aligned with the strength work, the strength on the pitch with this element. And then end of the week, before an afternoon and a morning off, then it could be probably the only time where long intervals can be used. But again, using them at the end of the session after almost 24 hours of rest, so that the higher amount of lactate produced and the loading of a higher overall running volume will actually have the time to be compensated and recovered between those days. Example of in season. So in that case, you have on the top of the slide, you have the team periodization, and in the bottom you have the substitute periodization. For the team, and we've seen already this type of microcycle already. There's probably something to do in terms of conditioning at different moments. But I'm going to start now with the substitute in the bottom. So as we've seen, for those who did not play, the day after the game, if we choose to have the day of rest at day +2, then the best moment to compensate for the subs is day +1. And in that case, we're going to try to have a bit of both in terms of neuromuscular load. So a type 2 high-speed running to get in the form of a generic type of running, and then a type 4 in the format of a small sided game, for example, that will increase the mechanical work. So for substitute, high-speed running through generic running and mechanical work through small-sided games. Then during the week, for a bit everyone, often we're going to reuse some kind of small-sided games to complement the strength days, with an emphasis on the mechanical work aspect. And by further, the end of the day could be an additional type of work, but more targeting the high-speed component in this matter, with a very, very low volume that can be done by both those who played and by the substitute, to make sure the high-speed running is kept, like we kept targeting and maintaining those specific demands. And finally, in the case of 2 matches per week, obviously those who played the 2 games will definitely not need to do any extra conditioning. For the subs that will either play one or the other, that will depend on, that will be more or less a 1-by-1 case scenario. But those who might not play either the first or the second game, we may have to reconsider a little bit the strategies. So let's say the player not playing the first game might do, as we discussed before, likely compensate with small sided games to get something specific. But he might not be able to repeat that the whole week only, and he might need to do a little bit of high sensitivity running by the end of the week. If he has missed the first and the second game, he would have definitely missed the high-speed running component. So we may have to introduce that a bit, not last minute, but with a lowered volume by the end of the week to make sure he still gets prepared a minimum for those demands. Trying to summarize a little bit the programmation. This is a bit of a busy slide, but it's a bit of the idea as we were using a decision tree already, and we can start by thinking obviously at the individual level whether the player has played more than 60 minutes or less. If he has played more than 60 minutes and then the next game is in less than 5 days, he might not be required to do anything. If he played more than 60 minutes but then the next game is in more than 5 days, then he will have the time to train, and in that case he could go through what we discussed before and be stimulated by a bit of everything. And then the bottom part of the graph is what happens for subs, depending if they played, and again when is meant to be the next game. And again, I cannot go into all the details, but I think that's a bit the process that practitioners have to go through in deciding the most appropriate content based, in this case, essentially on game minutes played and when the next game is going to happen. And this has been published as well with the reference, so if you want to go further into detail, this is obviously accessible. But I will say that it's so context dependent that it's more the process that matters than really the types of the sessions by itself. So to summarize now this second part on high-speed training, we discussed again the importance of understanding the hit target in relation to the periodization throughout the microcycle, but also within the session in relation to the tactical elements that may be just implemented just after or before the hit sequence. Based on that, it's important to select and fine-tune the weapon or the hit format to make sure that, for example, in the example of the high speed versus the mechanical work components, to make sure it really fits the sequence, and then adjust the volume of those sequences based on the weekly match load and player profile and position. And some of them might require more than others for those specific reasons. In the end, even though football is a team sport, there are way means to individualize those training. Easy to individualize using generic types of running, but if we still need to individualize using small-sided games, we see, for example, that jokers are an option. So irrespective of the tool used, there is always a way to individualize player loading and the use of high-speed training.